really, I think we have to think about restaking the same way we think about consensus. We have to build a market with some form of constraints that enables the most optimal economic incentives for those who act accordingly to the security of the network and the longevity of the network.
Right. We are here with Chunda on another installment of Blockswap Buzz. Chunda is the CEO of Ion Protocol, which is a new protocol around restaking and risk assessment of validators. Chunda, how are you?
I'm doing well, Derek. Doing well. Been on the traveling sprint for a little bit, but it's calming down. So I'm looking forward to kind of settling down and getting more time to work on the product.
Yeah, that's great. I know how it can be traveling around. So we linked up in ECC, and you were doing a lot of stuff there, a lot of different talks. How was ECC for you?
It was good. Busy, but busy in a good way. Kept us kind of running around talking to a lot of partners, ranging from like providers to node operators to, restaking platforms like yourself and folks at Eigenlayer. Um, was thankfully got the chance to speak at your guys' event about DeFi, how we can use DeFi to kind of like positively align restaking. I call like let's depend more on like market-based consensus. Um, and then also kind of like hosted with Jesse's Hacker House, a staking panel with like Oval, Mike and Layer, people. You guys were there, the folks at Verichain and some others, about kind of like the state of staking, the state of institutional staking ecosystem, restaking, and also kind of the implications of like credible commits on validator architecture. So a lot of really exciting conversations with some really sharp folks across the space.
Yeah, great. And thanks for joining us at our multi-chain ERC20 event. I know you didn't have a ton of time and you were talking very high level about different ideas and thoughts that you had around restaking, which was much appreciated, but we didn't get to really dive too much into Ion Protocol and what you do. So now that we have a little bit more time, I think it'd be great to start off. We can get some of your thoughts around restaking, and then move into some more of the details and the nitty gritty of Ion Protocol and what you're looking to do. So to kick us off,
Yeah.
could you run through a little bit of how you see restaking? In particular, you had mentioned a few times in ECC about there being different types of restaking. Could you go through those a little bit?
Yeah, 100%. I think like to start just like high level, like what I think about restaking in general. I think like restaking to me is the common sense extension of capital efficiency and proof of stake networks, right? Inherently, like the step of liquid staking tokens as a way to make validated capital liquid was the first step, and kind of this idea of capital efficiency for validators within proof of stake networks. But I think obviously the next step is like, okay, there's a difference between making capital liquid versus making it productive. And I think restaking is really the first step into saying like, okay, how can we build productivity for these assets, um, while also kind of being able to experience kind of the potential of making these productive assets also liquid in the same capacity. So we really kind of view restaking in like two different lenses. One is like the more simple version of restaking that I think everyone is most familiar with. It's what we call economic restaking. So economic restaking is essentially when you have capital that's being put up, like usually denominated in ETH, whether it's an LST or ETH itself, putting up to be slashed by some middleware provider. And there really is no inherent connection between the validator activity, the validator ownership of that collateral, and instead is more kind of an application layer kind of settlement of the slashable, what we call like slashable economic security. So the way we see this is like, eigenlayer LST positions are a version of this like kind of economic restaking. And then I know there's a version of Blockswap Cloud which also services the same use case. I would say the other type of restaking is the what we call like validator correlated restaking or hardware correlated restaking. And this is restaking that is native to a validator operator or an operator some arbitrary hardware setup in proof of stake network. In which case that if the operator on that network does a malicious or an aberrant action in accordance to the consensus protocol, the original network, they are either disincentivized in the external networks or can be slashed and removed from the provider set in the external networks as the function of their behavior in the initial consensus layer that they are kind of derived from. Which in this case, in most applications that are coming out now would be like a validator running on it.
Okay, so to kind of sum it up, thank you for that. You're referring to these two types of restaking. There's this economic restaking, which is slashable security and a node operator, and this could be any slashable security. And then there's sort of this consensus or validator restaking, which reuses Ethereum consensus in a way for these validators. So do these have a risk? I know you had a whole talk on it, but I think it'd be great to touch on the idea of overloading Ethereum consensus, which is a topic that's come up and it's been discussed quite a bit. But what's your viewpoint as somebody who works in restaking? I see a lot of viewpoints from people kind of all over the place with their 2 cents. But you working in restaking with Ion Protocol, how do you feel about overloading consensus?
Yeah, I actually think restaking is was like a fantastic invention, kind of along these lines, because it created a platform that made it very obvious, kind of the risks of overloading Ethereum consensus. But let's like kind of first take a step back and think about like overloading Ethereum consensus in general. Like, 'cause I feel like a lot of people have very different views and perspectives on like what that means. I think the way we think about overloading Ethereum consensus, right, and I kind of do this in the view of like interpreting how Vitalik wrote about it, is really when you create a situation in which two things happen. You have an exogenous dependency on some kind of large application suite, or for Ethereum itself, an exogenous dependency on another application. And then you create economic incentives tied into that exogenous dependency. Um, and when you get these two things in tandem, you get, what we can call like overloading security, where if that exogenous dependency fails or ends up being faulty, or ends up being attacked, well, there is an economic and social incentive to revert the state of Ethereum as a byproduct. A lot of people, may have remembered, like, or maybe not have remembered, but have heard of the DAO hack, kind of soon after the birth of Ethereum. This would essentially be like a similar type of scenario. And this is what we really think, or how I really perceive like overloading consensus, right? Um, and I think there are a lot of instances where overloading consensus is already the case, or can already be kind of seen without the birth of EigenLayer, and other restaking platforms. So one example of this is the dependency that DeFi has on USDC. Um, if by some form or function, the folks at Circle uh, decided to create a stance on a certain kind of hard fork of Ethereum being the true hard fork of Ethereum state, there is an argument or some contention to be said that because of how much economic value is secured by that asset, users could be users, and by users I mean like folks who validators and people who actually dictate which of like the hard forks are actually the canonical chain, may decide to use the canonical chain that supports that economic value, even if it's against the wishes of, let's say, the Ethereum Core Foundation, or against the wishes of like decentralization and things, so on and so forth. Um, and I
Sorry,
think,
can I step in here? So it sounds like
yeah,
you're
100%.
suggesting that um, that there's risks more on the social side than on the actual structure of of some of these applications.
100%. I think realistically, when we think about, and let's like kind of turn our focus to restaking platforms. When we think about restaking platforms, it just standardizes a method in which we can incentivize socially agreed upon hard forks. That's really where what it is. Because what is the downside effect of an aberrant slashing event? Let's say, uh, one of the large Oracle networks decides, okay, we're gonna restake on Icon. Most people would say, like, all right, this is probably one of the stronger places to restake and more secure places to restake. And I can get more steady yield because this is an asset that's already in circulation and has some kind of is market tested and so on and so forth. Um, and if that were to fail without any checks, right, and you were to see a large centralization, let's say the Oracle system kind of fell apart, you saw a large centralization of assets and certain holders that liquidated a large amount of positions, let's say all across DeFi, by providing false Oracle feeds, or a bug occurred in like a client update, and it caused a cascading liquidation event, which caused asset centralization within a few holders. Um, that would cause this is the exact same kind of incentive alignment as this is what I was saying before, this more looser exogenous dependency plus economic incentives, right? Restaking is just a platform to standardize this kind of dynamic of an exogenous dependency and the economic incentive alignment to incentivize social kind of reorgs of Ethereum state. Um,
So when
that's really where I
you
think the concern lies.
so when you're talking about this, is there particular things that you think could be implemented in protocol design to avoid this? Or are there different methods that could be performed? Or is this something that's can inevitably happen? So why not just make it easier for people to access this sort of consensus?
Yeah. Well, I think, and here's the beauty on kind of like what how we thought about Ion and like what we're working on at Ion is we really believe in the fact that you can create market conditions and you can build primitives that are focused on um, enabling better economic outcomes for more trustless, decentralized, and performant validator and restaking architecture. So, because you can essentially decrease your credit risk and like the centralization and failure risk, right? Which is exactly what we're trying to kind of price or evaluate. So when you look at, for example, let's say like this instance of slashing and like an Oracle network, so on and so forth. Um, if we know that this Oracle network has, let's say, 90% utilization of all restake deposits, like 90% of all restake ETH on all platforms is restaking to this position. Well, we know that economically this presents a large centralization risk, and the cascading effect of a slashing event in the system and for all positions exposed to the system would be quite large. And so in a diversified ETF of various different kind of restaking positions, um, this would be, potentially a lot less creditworthy than a more diversified kind of portfolio of restaking positions. And so you can actually price credit risk in a way where if you can evaluate that risk, actually decrease the capital efficiency of any type of lending market or leverage position on that type of restaking position. And as a byproduct, economically incentivize people to decentralize into safer, or let's just say a more decentralized kind of restaking position or like ETF restaking positions. So I think that like in general, like holistically, the really the core thesis is that you need market-based mechanisms of incentivizing decentralized kind of allocations of capital towards consensus, and then trustless infrastructure that's focused on validators to really be able to kind of support this future of like positively aligning restaking. And there's kind of a lot more like other things that I think we can implement there. But I think like really thinking in that frame of mindset about like how do consensus protocols work? Consensus protocols inherently, or in proof of stake, like proof of stake as a consensus protocol is simply a market with a lot of constraints that enable those that participate in that market of penalties and rewards to be positively incentivized to, be align themselves in, the most best and like the most performant action that the chain dictates, right? Um, and really, I think we have to think about restaking the same way we think about consensus. We have to build a market with some form of constraints that enables the most optimal economic incentives for those who act accordingly to the security of the network and the longevity of the network.
So I have a question that just kind of popped up in my head regarding you
Yeah,
keep referencing oracles and you keep referencing eigenlayer, which is a method of economic restaking. Now, do you see that there could be some misalignment between economic restaking and oracles on there when, these like an oracle provides the price feed for these LSTs. And if LSTs are used as the collateral and there's no actual tie to an Ethereum validator, for that settlement security, that validator security, this is just people who are running nodes, a slashable LST, which is supporting this Oracle, and this Oracle is running the LST or the LST price feeds. Is this become like an attack vector, like some sort of loop here,
bit
if
of
you
a
don't
house of
if you don't
cards.
incorporate an actual Ethereum validator into the mix?
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is why I kind of put an emphasis on trustless architecture, right? Both on the infrastructure side and on the financial side. Um, that I completely agree. You kind of have a principal agent problem when it comes to economic restaking and securing and defining economic value, right? Because then you essentially have, even in like a non like on-chain environment, you could have like off-chain bribes and kind of off-chain incentives to, let's say, report the wrong price feed if you're going to get rewarded for doing so on like in a side deal. Like there are a lot of collusion attack vectors there if you don't kind of rope people in to kind of a more secure and trustless architecture. And so there's kind of like two ways you could address this, right? One way is trustless architecture within financial products. You need to build financial products that if you're basing LST prices off of oracles, you should instead be basing LST prices off of like ZK based credible commits on validator state, right? And that's kind of one of the things that we're working on because we really believe that, at the end of the day, secondary market prices, especially for, more like new entrants in the provider space, as well as kind of the stratified risk of a lot of icon layer positions and restaking positions when they come out. Um, will not necessarily lend itself to be very um, kind of underwritable by the traditional kind of like dependency on secondary market liquidity, under risk underwriting, and that you need to focus on kind of a different source of truth when it comes to underwriting these types of assets. And this lies in building trustless architecture that's tied to like what? That's tied to like Ethereum validators at the end of the day and like validator state. And then on the kind of like infrastructure side, if you're building restaking platforms, you need to, this doesn't eliminate kind of collusion vector risk, but it minimizes it because you now have economic trade-offs. If you tie kind of the activity of a restaking position in these various different middleware to the actual performance of a validator, the collateral in a validator, and the capital that can get slashed in a specific validator, well, then you can create this economic incentive tie-in for these different types of assets. So yeah, completely agree. Like that is one of the things that I think a lot about when it comes to building our architecture, when it comes to kind of the implications of these kind of new restaking platforms that are really paving the way for how we think about restaking, both economic and validator correlated. I think, the like being able to focus on restaking alignment holistically is one of the most important things we have to get right, and will define kind of how restaking kind of affects Ethereum and the greater industry as a whole.
So you were talking about these using these LSTs that are based on an oracle and trying to underwrite the risk of the validator. Um, so with Steakhouse, we don't use any oracles either. It's just pure redemption of underlying validator ETH, and we think that that's very important. And I'm curious how you guys are working that in. If you could speak a little bit more to how you're handling that risk and why it is such a risk when it comes to restaking.
Yeah. So for context on like kind of what we're doing at Ion's essentially like the primitive and the underlying infrastructure is like a validator, credit risk underwriting, and analysis, a platform of which we build financial primitives on top. The first of which that we're going to market with quite soon in the near future is a lending platform for users of any validator-backed assets from LSTs all the way to restaking positions, right? And you're completely right. Like the thing that we want to focus on a lot is like, what does it actually mean for a validator backed asset to be creditworthy, right? That's kind of the key question in a post withdrawals world. And kind of our philosophy there is that you're kind of beacon, or no pun intended, but your kind of like beacon of truth is the beacon chain itself and beacon chain state, right? The true redemption value of an LST or a restaking position is the actual redemption value of that position to collateral in the beacon chain in a validator cell.
What
What
goes
we
into those factors? I'm really curious what you guys are considering. How are you determining,
Yeah.
what makes something more credible? Is it the amount of dilution? Is it the amount of yield? Are you actually somehow counting and saying there's this many derivatives, there's this many inside the beacon chain? Because the numbers on a lot of these are different. Like, how are you
Yeah, so
evaluating
you have
those?
to track, and the implementation details are different. So you have to track a couple different things, right? So we'll use like an average permission provider setup, just like as an instance, right? In your regular like permission provider, where you have depositors, you have your provider contracts, and then you have a set of node operators. Um, for your depositors, you have some kind of deposit contract that users usually deposit their funds in. And then from that deposit contract, the funds usually get sent to some other proxy contract that then issues out like 32 ETH increments to the node operator set. And then usually you have some kind of insurance fund that might be a result of, let's say, like yield over time or kind of the native token, or let's say like, might be part of the margin or the users can provide capital to insurance pool, whatever. Let's say there's just some insurance pool with some ETH inside, right? And so what we do is like, okay, in this just like this very simple generalized system, how do you actually track like the true redemption value of an asset? And so beacon chain state is like definitely one thing that you have to focus on. So when it comes to all the node operators, like usually all these providers, their node operator index or like the validator index in terms of validator public keys are public in the contracts themselves. So you can actually track every single validator that is in the index of a given provider. Um, and then what you have to do is track the circulating supply of the LST itself. That already gives you a ratio of capital in, yeah, I see why I asked the question. Capital in the validator set and then capital outstanding in credit token. But there's more, right? There's ETH deposit in the deposit contract. There's ETH in like this insurance contract. And so we actually factor in the exogenous kind of balance of these two kind of pools as well, let's say in this instance, and would track that as like part of the quote unquote total reserve of provider. And then we match that to the kind of total outstanding supply of that credit token that is linked to the underlying collateral. The redeemability, as long as withdrawals are enabled and correlated to the actual beacon chain, the redeemability of those assets we consider assured 1-to-1. Um, and that ratio that we create between the two essentially is what we call like the redeemability ratio, or is like one of the inputs to kind of our risk modeling framework.
Okay, so that's super interesting because it sounds like what you're suggesting is that LST's redemption value should not be 1-to-1, that there's a lot of other factors that are kind of at play here. Um, so just out of curiosity, and maybe this is asking too many of the details, but in this risk modeling, I think a lot of the people in the LST community would be curious, what is an LST generally worth after you've went through your risk profile and your redemption? Like what do you consider the redemption rate of an LST?
So it actually varies pretty wildly. And the reason why is is because of how we think about node operator setups and bonds, right? Um, and how exactly do bonds fit into the redeemability of a position? So, for like context for those who like aren't familiar, like bonds are for in permissionless node operator setups. Users who want to manage the validator usually have to put up some form of capital as kind of insurance, what we call a bond. And this capital, essentially, you can't mint an LST out of it, and instead, kind of sits in your position, is kind of the recognition, like the on-chain recognition of your position, by the provider. And then other people, like exogenous, like retail, or it can be retail, institutional, whatever, capital comes into the system, gets matched with the bonds to make 32, kind of holes of 32, and then that acts as like the validator instance that then earns yield. Um, and the reason why I say it's a bit different is because when you introduce bonds into the system, bonds are kind of like the first, what we call like that first kind of tranche, or like protection tranche against slashing events. Um, and so depending on how you set up like bond ratios between how much is bonded versus how much is like openly collateralized, and then like how much restaking exposure you have, changes your redemption value risk. Um, High bond, like in general, the general like correlation is like higher bonds, plus like lower counterparty assets equals more redeemability, safer redeemability. There are contingencies there depending on how you actually structure your provider architecture. But generally that's the case. So like the more you have a bond, like usually the more secure the counterparty liquidity is, and therefore your redeemability value is generally higher. But like I said, there's a lot of exogenous details, things like node operator density, like how decentralized is your node operator set? Can you actually prove that like different node operators actually being different entities? Something that we've been kind of interested in chatting with like some DVT providers with is the actual like proof of DVT, proof of ownership within a DVT cluster, um, and like kind of Sybil resistance in DVT clusters as well. And being able to prove that would actually decrease your default risk because you kind of decentralize key ownership and can prove the key ownership is actually decentralized between different players and different operators. So there's kind of a couple instances of ways where the bond isn't just everything, but you can kind of use that as like a rough guideline to think about, okay, how safe is an asset just generally by the or how safe is a position generally by the provider architecture itself.
So I guess I'm curious. I have a few questions from there. How do you see Steakhouse as an e-staking operating system where it doesn't rely on an oracle, just redeemability? How do you see that fitting inside of this framework?
Yeah, so Steakhouse essentially is a system that enables redeemability for any user, and essentially like it's not a bond in the traditional sense, but the kind of slot tokens that are put up by the operator themselves, that earn the execution layer rewards, um, effectively act as like a pseudo bond in the cloud system, in which like the slots essentially are your like insurance liquidity, right? Um, so in that sense, you it's pretty stock standard with most permissionless lending protocols. I think most everyone kind of sits at this kind of 4 ETH um, ish like barrier when it comes to bonds. I think it is a better model than any permissioned uh, kind of validator set or any permissioned like liquid staking provider. And since you can essentially house pre-signed instances of your exit message, and essentially anyone can execute like the exit message and have like one-to-one redeemability of their underlying assets, it's definitely like one of the most robust with, let's say, like two other providers or three other providers that are about on the same level. And in my opinion, one of the most robust like kind of redemption and kind of I would say like liquidity security mechanisms for for staking in general.
Got it. So when looking at, I know you had mentioned DVT, and it was in a little bit of a different context than this question, but I did want to talk a little bit about DVT and how it fits into this idea of validator restaking. And, is it possible that, when you're doing validator restaking, economic restaking, completely different thing, but with validator restaking,
Yeah.
these node operators who are working with DVT, that's multiple people who have access to the same validator. Could
Mhm.
this be an opportunity for a type of almost leverage in restaking because multiple people have access to it, or does it add a layer of? Do you see it as just an added layer of risk as another middleware in between? So I'm curious, like where you think DVT sort of fits within the validator restaking conversation.
Yeah. So DVT is kind of interesting. If you look at, so if we exclude economic restaking, we focus on validator native restaking. Um, my kind of perspective, and I'm curious of any pushback here, is that DVT generally decreases your credit risk. And the reason why is because, well, let's look at the alternative, right? In an alternative like the traditional setting, you have one owner of a validator, right? One node operator. We're assuming a permissionless context here. One owner of a node operator who owns the keys, and essentially that node operator, that owner of those keys, essentially has ultimate control if that validator gets slashed, or if they have an aberrant setup and they inadvertently get themselves slashed, or so on and so forth, right? Whereas in DVT, theoretically, if you can actually split up ownership of the keys between multiple participants in a single validator, and trustlessly prove that they are actually different owners of the key itself, um, like different entities that own the key. Well, you actually decrease the surface area of risk when it comes to um, like double signing on purpose, because you increase like the coordination cost and overhead, as well as it's just more difficult to push that decision through, and it's a lot less quick and opportunistic. Um, so you decrease the chance of slashing, and effectively you decrease the incentive to slash too, as well, or the incentive to slash yourself, and the likelihood of inadvertent slashes. So the likelihood of someone pushing through and an aberrant update to the system, or meddling with the system setups, and on the hardware level, and like um, screwing up their validator operations, becomes a lot more diminished if you require the consensus of multiple parties to actually perform any updates on a validator setup. So in general, I think DVT actually reduces the surface area risk significantly. And we encourage more folks to run DVT setups accordingly. Now, there is kind of a trade-off right now where there is some impact on the downside of DVT setups on validator performance holistically, because of kind of constraints on geographical location, like signature aggregation, and so on and so forth. But I feel like in an end state where we have truly performant like DKG, then you know, ideally most people are running DVT setups.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I guess I'm curious. We've talked about a few different parties within the Ethereum ecosystem. There's, DVT on one side, there's LSTs and LSDs on another side. And now you guys are injecting ion to kind of underlie some of this credit risk for restaking. Are there any other parties that people should be considering when it comes to restaking, or are these really the main players? And I know that there's probably quite a few differences if we're looking at economic restaking versus validator restaking. Um, are there things that people aren't talking about that they should be talking about, or other things that should be considered in the way of different layers within consensus mechanisms, or what do you think should be brought into the conversation here?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that were so there's two things in general I think are some of the biggest things that are kind of unresolved in kind of restaking platform architecture currently. Um, one of which is more of a research question, the other of which is more of a kind of organizational and kind of like product design question. Um, so in the product design question, the question is, what does the operator relationship look like? And so this is both an economic and validator based restaking question. What I mean by operator, I mean the individual or individuals who are running um, middleware client instances or software instances on some kind of arbitrary hardware setup, be it on their validator itself or on some other cloud instance. In order to run, or in order for middleware to operate, they need to have some kind of corresponding or correlated hardware setup or hardware performing some action. You know, whether those actions are attestations and signature propagation, similar to um, like Ethereum validators, or some other arbitrary action and some other random kind of consensus protocol. You need that system to be doing something. And I think it is a huge design space. What does the operator experience look like from the operator perspective? How do users interact with operators? How do middleware select which operators they want to include, disinclude? What are the parameters that you can use to dictate that? What do we think about OFAC compliance and KYC and kind of general like kind of legal jurisdictions with folks who are running operator hardware? What kinds of operator hardware are required to run in order to be able to use these like middleware? Are light clients possible? Can we have like middleware light clients where anyone can from their phone run like an operator for middleware? Yeah, so I think there are a lot of really exciting kind of places to explore within like this kind of new field of hardware operators for middleware that really hasn't been touched on. And then on when we think about kind of the other side of the equation and more in this like research focused section, I think this idea of like how do we extend credible commitment architecture, so things like ZK based state proof commits for like various arbitrary middleware and like actually allowing trustless um, proofs of like middleware slashing events and other instances like middleware data to Ethereum, to different like middleware clients, to applications on Ethereum that are, underwriting this restaking risk like us. That's a huge question. Like, how do we generalize these proofs? Is it possible to generalize these proofs or these commitments? If not, can we create a standard that a lot of restaking middleware can adhere to? Um, I think there's so much kind of empty space there to explore. And that just is kind of the start. And then we look towards things like multi-prover systems, right? Because we talked a little bit more or a little bit before about like kind of reducing the surface area for social consensus risk. I think multi-prover kind of systems for agreeing on middleware state is going to be very important to achieve that. So how do we build multi-prover systems? Do we have like are we going to build like multi-prover architecture that is generalizable? Are we going to have like a kind of multi-prover like Gnosis system esque system for middleware that middleware can plug and play? I think there are entire companies I think that can be built to answer these research questions, and I'm really excited to kind of see how the industry develops in really solving and answering these things.
Great. So that's very big picture. Thank you. Thank you for sharing some of that. So now I'm curious a little bit more about Ion. Can we tie in Ion into this conversation? I know you've mentioned it a few times throughout. Now I'd like to kind of hone in and really focus on what you guys are doing. Like, what are the biggest problems that you solved? What problems that we've discussed do you guys have solutions for? What are you doing now, and where's it going to be?
Yeah. I think like to kind of center is like what is matter, right? First is like very simplistically, like what are we doing? Kind of mentioned it before. We want to focus on this idea that validator credit risk is different than the credit risk we underwrite in DeFi, right? The redeemability of validator backed assets is the most important thing to validator credit risk in a post withdrawals world. Whereas when we look at traditional kind of how quote unquote credit or basis risk is underwritten in DeFi traditionally, it really has nothing to do with that. So we want to build kind of the financial infrastructure to kind of observe, underwrite, and really build products around this idea of validator credit risk. And so, like, how do we do that? So I've talked a lot about trustless commitments. One of the things that we're working on is building out a ZKML supported credit risk on kind of analysis infrastructure where we can actually um, analyze and price like kind of validate credit risk on the beacon chain and eventually like extend that model to other consensus protocols and middleware as well. Um, and then utilize trustless architecture such as ZK-based state proofs to actually port the consensus layer information over from these various different consensus environments into our lending platform. And our lending platform will be essentially completely price agnostic and instead focus on this kind of redeemability value of validators and validator assets such as LSTs all the way to staking positions um, in the execution layer. And by allowing users to deposit their assets, such as LSTs, into staking positions in Ion, you're able to kind of play with these financial products that we'll build on top. The first of which is what we're calling all ETH. You can think of all ETH as an ETH denominated asset, which tracks the price of ETH. You deposit your assets and can mint out this kind of credit position that you can then utilize in the ecosystem to leverage on your position, hedge against it, and do any kind of financial activities you want. And that's kind of like the first in a product suite of ideally many that we have on our roadmap to kind of play out. And really, the kind of core thing we're focusing on is this: is kind of two things. One is that when kind of I first came across the idea of eigenlayer and the implications of it, I realized that restaking as a whole holistically is going to introduce kind of stratified credit risk and really introduce at least at first before liquidity settles on some kind of short tail of risk adjusted I think like ETF positions. We're going to see a lot of like liquidity fragmentation and illiquid representations of restaking positions as well as like LST providers matched with restaking positions in the near to medium term. And I believe that we need to find a new method of kind of underwriting those assets. So we built Ion in kind of response to that. The other thing is when it comes to building infrastructure to positively align restaking, I think, market oriented infrastructure and like market based and economic based incentives is realistically the only way that we're going to be able to actually execute on this future. At least until we get things like single shot cryptography and things like that. But it's like way into the future, right? Um, and so in the interim, I really believe that, we can build a system where we can actually incentivize with our financial products more better and more trustless validator architecture and create, better economic rewards for these users. And ideally, we can be the platform that for validator-backed assets is the most capital efficient in the ecosystem with the least liquidation risk and ideally the lowest interest rates, risk adjusted possible for our users. And that's kind of like the idea and the philosophy behind kind of what we're building out.
So for everybody who's made it this far in the podcast and is still a little bit unsure about Ion, how would you sum up what Ion does? 15 seconds. What's the ultra elevator like? How do you
For
what would you
elevator
put it?
pitch,
The elevator of the elevator,
got a
one
new
floor of the
way.
elevator. Yeah,
Yeah, from floor one to floor two. I'll tell you, I'm building a new way to underwrite validator or any type of asset that has validators behind it. So that way you can get more leverage or more capital efficiency, um, lower liquidation risk, and more acceptance of pretty much any asset you want in the staking space with an easy UI UX.
great.
That's our goal for the average user, the average staker. That's what we want to achieve.
You are taking it from staking to restaking, and you are now saying you can re-restake. Is that right?
You're not restaking with our credit asset. At least that's not the plan. But yes, you can financially apply restake positions in the greater DeFi ecosystem. Yes.
Great. So how would people get in touch with you? Could you give us a few shouts, a little shill time here?
Yeah. Time to show all the bags, pump the bags.
Yeah.
I'd say you can find us and the team and kind of what we're working on at Twitter at Ion Protocol. That's one word, ION, like polyatomic ion, like back in chemistry, protocol. Um, our Medium, same thing. If you want to go find our docs, that's docs.ionprotocol.io. And if you want to kind of shoot a DM towards me, um, and chat more about the future of restaking or things like positive restaking alignment, feel free to reach me at my first name and last name. It's just at Chunda McCain on Twitter. Love chatting with folks who are kind of interested in the space and potentially building. We really want to encourage people to build on top of kind of the risk underwriting framework that we're building in. I have so many ideas of different financial products that could be kind of built. So if you kind of want to take a first stab at kind of working on some of these projects and problems, would love to chat about that as well.
Open invitation to talk to Chunda. That is incredible. Great. Is there anything else that you wanna add before we hop off here?
I'd like to say, or yes, one more thing. We are hiring. We are hiring two engineers. Are looking for two engineers to join our team. So if any of you guys are interested in anything from ZKML all the way to you know DeFi mechanism design and lending protocol and innovations on the lending protocol space, like feel free to reach out. If you go to our Twitter, we have kind of a link for like our job board. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you, Derek, for having me on, and the Blockswap people for inviting me over in Paris. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys on as time goes on, and look to see Blockswap cloud positions on Ion soon, TM.
Yeah, Chunda, yes, great chatting with you. Thanks for coming out. It's always exciting to hear what you're working on. It sounds like every time that we get a chance to talk, there's been some leaps and strides from Ion. So I'm excited for the next time we get to communicate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you just want to catch it.